My mom has been my biggest gift and my
Mhm.
biggest challenge in life. What are the
Mhm.
signs of a mother that's narcissistic? A mother that is very entitled, lacks empathy. Everything revolves around her. She might be jealous of her daughter. She might compete with her daughters. If the daughter is going through some sort of, emotional experience, she will try to top those feelings and say, well, I had it worse, or I've had a really stressful day. Well, let me tell you about my situation.
Why did I have to have a mother this way? Why didn't I have a normal quote unquote mother who is loving, who is caring, who's accepting, who is not constantly criticizing me, who's not constantly making me feel like I'm not good enough or I'm never going to meet her standards or her expectation? Hola a todos, todas y todes. Bienvenidos a otro episodio de the Heal and Manifest podcast. I am your host, Cynthia Flores. I'm really excited to have a special guest for today. Her name is Juriana Hernandez. She is also a licensed marriage and family therapist. Today, what we're going to be talking about is healing the mother wound. So thank you so much, Juliana. What we're going to be talking about for today is just really explaining a little bit of what is a mother wound, based on also Juliana's professional experiences. She's going to be talking about narcissistic abuse, particularly with mothers. And we're going to talk about specific signs about these two and also how to start identifying them, but how to also start healing from that and taking on the first steps to identifying, exploring, processing, and finding the right support for you to heal, right, from experiencing the mother wound or narcissistic abuse with mothers. So thank you so much for being here, Juliana. So let me introduce Juliana. She is, as I mentioned, a licensed marriage and family therapist who helps women understand their mother wounds so they can create healthy relationships, so they can feel joy and they can feel excitement about life and love. So Juliana is an expert in the recovery of narcissistic emotional abuse, and she has experienced that firsthand and is confident that with the right tools and support, you can also heal and live an empowered life. So I appreciate Juliana for being here and just really talking about this very, very important topic and things and experiences that I'm sure a lot of our clients have gone through and experienced. And I'm glad that you're here to kind of bring your personal and professional knowledge and expertise about this. I often get asked a lot in my therapy practice with clients about just like especially with the Latina community, the Latina community, I find that there's a lot of narcissistic abuse that happens, particularly with mothers.
Yeah.
And of course, there's not a lot of knowledge out there. I think we're still bringing it up into our awareness around what language to use when it comes to navigating uh, estranged or conflict with mothers, right? With our mothers. But it's something that I do see a lot, especially for Latinas. And I can't wait to hear more about your experience. So thank you so much for being here. And I guess I'm curious for you. I know you mentioned that you do have firsthand personal experience, but I'm curious what really got you to be curious and start doing this work.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm so excited to talk about this topic because, like you said, it's not just something that I do in my professional life, but it's also something that I experience in my personal life. So I want to go back to something that you said about how there isn't a lot of information. Although over the years, I want to say that through social media, it has become more like a pop psychology type thing to talk about
Yeah.
narcissism. But I want to go back to when I was in grad school. I did not get taught, I mean, just the basic understanding of personality disorders and how to be able to
Mhm.
diagnose and be able to see that, right? But it wasn't through school that I learned about what is narcissism and like the different phases of narcissism, and how, on
Mm.
some level, we all have narcissistic tendencies. But
Mhm.
when does it become more destructive, right? When can we start to say, oh, this is something that is really affecting um, the people, the families, right? When is it something where it's like, okay, this is causing distress in people.
Mhm.
So for me, the way that I came to find out that my mom has narcissistic tendencies or traits is through therapy. I actually remember
Mm.
speaking to a therapist about what I was experiencing in my life, and she gave me this book that was so helpful for me. And
Mm.
it's a book now that I think a lot of people talk about, but if you don't know, it's Will I Ever Be Good Enough?
Mm.
To the daughters of narcissistic mothers. And it was through that book that a lot of like insight and knowledge came for me about what is narcissism, and not just what I was taught in grad school about narcissism.
Yeah, wow. Thanks for sharing that. And
Yeah.
you are so right. And I do want to bring that awareness around, how pop culture and pop psychology on social media, we are seeing more, right? There's more accessibility of resources of information around what is narcissism and how does it show up? What are the signs? What are the characteristics? And all of these things, and what is also the root of it, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of like a negative connotation, or just like you think about someone who's narcissistic and you're like, damn, like that's, they're like evil people, and I think I know that they can create a lot of trauma and a lot of harm. I think it's important to also humanize, right, people in
Yeah.
a way that, not to say that what they're doing is okay, but or justifying their behaviors, but from understanding human behavior and where that might be coming from, right? So
Yeah.
I think that's also something that I always try to think about, although I wouldn't personally want to be or deal with someone who is a narcissist. And I feel like as therapists, like I know that I can, like, tell for someone who
Mm-hmm.
has these traits, like the moment I talk to them, the moment I engage with them. And I think that that's because of the training and the work that we do, and probably personal experience in dealing with people, right? Relationships, not only parental relationships, but also romantic relationships. And like
Mm-hmm.
you said, like, I think you're right about that we may all have some traits, right, of
Mm-hmm.
narcissists, because we all try to focus on ourselves, right? And at the end of the day, we also have a lot of unhealthy, or maybe, yeah, unhealthy or unhelpful patterns or coping mechanisms that we learned as a way to survive, right?
Right.
So I guess I wanted to just definitely name that. And of course, we're not like out here trying to like have you diagnose like your mother, or
Yeah.
at least that you are aware of what is your experience, right? Because
Right.
I think that sometimes when it comes to like narcissism, and we see it on social media all the time, like, oh, this person is narcissistic, or this person is toxic. And then it's like, it's also easy to blame others, right? And not take that personal kind of responsibility of saying, well, how can I start introspecting, self-reflecting, bring that awareness around where, how am I contributing to this dynamic, and how can I set those boundaries to protect myself, whether it
Right.
is removing myself, whether it is doing other things to take care of me and prioritize
Mm-hmm.
myself. So I wanted to just name that. So thank you so much
Yeah.
for also
Yeah.
normalizing that.
Yeah. And there's so much that you're saying that I want to like really hone in about, and I know we're going to get into this, but part of the healing is labeling. Like if
Mm,
you can identify and recognize what these signs are, that is a big part of the healing process. And so I know we
mm,
go back to like social media where it's like, oh, we're calling everybody a narcissist now. Like that could be so damaging. And
mm,
I see that side, but I also see how healing it is when you're able to understand and label, right? There's language that comes around narcissistic abuse, like
mm,
gaslighting and gray rock and all of these things. And what does the narcissistic cycle of abuse look like? So that information actually is very healing and very helpful for anybody
yeah,
that's caught up in these type of dynamics. And so I just wanted to like reinforce that. And something
of
else that
course.
you said about humanizing someone that, whether they have narcissistic personality disorder or they have tendencies or traits, is like there is a human aspect of this. And I think that's part of the healing of having compassion and understanding of how did this come to be, and really knowing.
Mm,
And I don't think a lot of people get to know the story of like, well, tell me about your childhood. Tell me about like
mm,
how were your parents with you? What happened to you? What didn't you get that caused you to then develop this, right?
yeah.
So that's just something that I really wanted to just reinforce.
Yeah, and this goes back, as I mentioned, the learned coping mechanisms as a way to survive, right?
Yeah,
And like I said, like it can be really hard. I think that's something that as a person, not as a therapist, I also grapple with. Like with, you know, how can I be passionate and understanding that there's usually a story behind, even though I may be dealing with someone who has these traits and I can't stand to be around. But like, how do I set healthy boundaries, whether it is, placing them in a place in my life where it's going to feel healthy for me. But I think like that can be very, very hard. Right. And I'm, like I said,
yeah,
there can be a lot of conflicting feelings maybe when you're listening to this podcast, because
yeah,
I'm also, to this episode, I'm not justifying narcissistic
yeah,
abuse. And I do believe in the power of personal accountability and responsibility and choice, and in whatever capacity, because I do think that when someone experiences narcissistic abuse, it's sometimes you're at a maybe very hard space where you may not have developed that resiliency, that ability to bounce back, that maybe there's other traumatic experiences or
yeah,
adverse childhood experiences that you went through, that it makes it very difficult to develop these coping mechanisms that will help you thrive, right,
right.
rather than just functioning or operating on this survival, which a lot of
Mhm.
like a lot of people that are recovering from narcissistic abuse, primarily with narcissistic abuse, can be very hard, right? It's not like a linear process when it comes to healing, especially if you have a continuously contact with them,
Right.
right? So there's the family dynamics where you're probably involved, with your mother. You're probably involved in seeing her regularly, speaking to her, maybe living with her, right? And
Hmm.
or there's the other situation, right, where maybe you're completely cut off or estranged from them because you realize this is toxic for me. This, I can't do this anymore. It's impairing and impacting my mental health, and I need to prioritize myself, right? So
Yeah,
there's, I think, like in doing this work, and I'm sure you're going to talk a little bit more about it, is, and what I've experienced with clients, and with navigating these sort of relationship dynamics, is that it's very nuanced, it's
yeah,
complex, these relationship dynamics with experiencing mother wounds, experiencing this sort of narcissistic mothers. It's very nuanced, it's not linear. Like everyone has a very unique family system, family dynamic, and it's going to look very different for everyone. And even some of
Right.
these signs and symptoms and presentations and the way it shows up for you in your relationship with your mother is going to be very different and unique.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like to say that we don't heal, right? Like we are healing parts of ourselves because, as you
Mhm.
said, if you still have a relationship with your mom, there's going to be things that are going to show up, that are going to
Yeah.
happen, your phase of life, like where you are, what are you experiencing, right? That might then trigger, or that abuse might show up. And so I don't like to see it as like it's a one and done, like how you said, it's not black and white. It's
Mhm.
definitely a journey.
Yeah.
And one thing that I say is that my mom has been my biggest gift and my
Mhm.
biggest challenge in life. And
Mhm.
so there, even though there's been pain there, there's also a lot of love. And so for me, that's just it's like a navigating. Like I'm
Mhm.
navigating this relationship as I move through life. And sometimes there's beautiful moments, and then other times there isn't. And so
Yeah.
that's just a way to maybe start to see this. And again, I like you said, it depends on, the severity and kind of where they are on that spectrum.
Yeah, thanks for naming that. And that's beautiful in healing in itself, right? Just accepting what is and figuring out if whoever is listening continues to have this relationship with your mother, right? Because like you said, it's not just black and white. It's not like
Mm-mm.
I think I see this a lot in our Latino community. It's like we want to keep them there. We want to have this relationship. We want to feel loved and accepted by our mothers. So somehow we try to change, right? We try to change either ourselves, our perspective, maybe seeing it in a different lens, and maybe responding or interacting or setting boundaries very differently to
Yeah,
figure out how to respond in situations where maybe you're attacked, you're triggered, you are, could maybe continue this cycle of abuse, right, of narcissistic abuse. But it's not linear. So
it's not. Yeah.
yeah.
And you're alluding to something that has to do with the healing process, which is like radical acceptance.
Hmm.
Right? That part in itself can be so difficult because it's the grief, right? Around
Mm.
I was
Yeah.
hoping then that at some point she was going to change, or things were going to be different, and then
Yeah.
realizing that, you know, there isn't a lot of change. And so part of it is just, this is who my parent is. This doesn't mean anything negative about me. We are both on our own journeys. And so we're together but separate, right? Especially because we come from a collectivistic culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not one of our value systems to be like, peace out, I'm never going to see you again. And so it's this, again, I go back to, it's navigating the relationship just kind of where you are in your life.
Yes, yes. Thanks for naming that. I guess in your personal experience or professional experience, what are some of the signs or behaviors or patterns that are very common that we see around like narcissistic abuse, um, narcissistic mother abuse?
Yeah, I think I'm going to break it into two different things. So, what are the
Mhm.
signs of a mother that's narcissistic? So, a mother that is very entitled, lacks empathy, everything revolves around her. She might be jealous of her daughter or daughters. She might compete with her daughters. Whenever there is a situation going on for the daughter, she diverts the attention back to her. If the daughter is going through some sort of, emotional experience, she will try to top those feelings and say, well, I had it worse, or I've had a really stressful day. Well, let me tell you about my situation. So it always kind of comes back and circles back to the mom. There's a lot of shame that gets projected onto the daughter, so that there's narcissistic shame. being critical, caring a lot about what people think. El que dirán, right? They worry a lot about what people are going to think about the family, about them, about the daughters, because they don't see their daughters as separate, like having their own sense of self, their own life, their own opinions. They see them as an extension of them. Daughters feeling like they're walking on eggshells, right? Like they can't really truly be themselves. Also feeling like their moms don't really know who they are, and sometimes even they don't know who they are because they never really got to explore that. Yeah, I would say those are some of the
Wow.
signs that come up for me. Yeah.
Wow. And how are these sort of how do these play out? Like if I guess I'm just thinking about because these relationship dynamics are so nuanced and patterns, right? How have you seen it play out usually? For instance, I know that you mentioned the mother doesn't really see the daughter as an extension. I mean, she
As
sees
her own
her,
self.
yeah,
Yeah.
she sees her as her own self. So I'm just trying to understand how does what is the psychology behind that?
Yeah.
And yeah, how does that show up?
Right. So I guess what happens for the daughter then, right? Since she
Mhm.
doesn't have a sense of self and really she was conditioned to please her mom. So what ends up happening is that there's very low self-esteem, low sense of self-worth. They might value themselves based off of what they do and not who they are. So what can I give, right? Because that's how they were conditioned. What can I give
Mm,
in order to be of value?
mm,
They might have learned, right, if this is something that was reinforced, that being pretty or having good grades or being an overachiever were valued. And so that they kind of focus on those things. They become people pleasers. They have a really difficult time with setting boundaries or really understanding what healthy boundaries look like. They can't express, or they have a really difficult time expressing how they feel, what they think. And sometimes they're so detached from that because if the mother had a really difficult time, most narcissistic mothers, I would say, have a difficult time with like holding space and like containing emotions. They don't
mm,
they don't really like that unless it's giving them narcissistic supply and they're feeling in some sort of way that it's helping them feel seen and feel important. So
mm,
because it's so distorted, right? Narcissistic daughters grow up feeling very confused.
mm,
And it's not unusual for you to, there's a word in the narcissistic language of like being under the spell. Like you didn't
mm,
know, right? Because this is all you saw growing up. And so then growing up and realizing that this is not a healthy mother daughter dynamic. And so kind of waking up and being like, whoa, what the heck was all of this about? And sometimes you don't
mm,
find that out until like maybe you're in your teens, later teens, you go away to college, or you are seeing other family systems where then you're starting to pick up on, wait a minute, how come I didn't get that? They might
mm,
experience depression, anxiety. There's that trauma that comes with this, illness. So because you were always focused on others, right? You tend to be so disconnected from your own body, from your own sense of what's happening with me. So sometimes like self-care is almost even neglected as well, just because you're just
mm.
so detached and disconnected from yourself. So that is
Yeah.
what happens to the daughter, the
Mhm.
effects of it. Yeah.
Wow. And I guess, these are clicking for me because I do work with a lot of clients who have experienced a lot of these things, right? That you just mentioned. And how does this correlate to experiencing a mother wound, right? And maybe how would you define the
Yeah.
mother wound?
Yeah, thank you for, I think we have to define that, right? So
Yeah.
my definition of a mother wound is the unprocessed emotional pain or trauma, right? And it could be influenced by, because we have to look at, it's a systemic thing. right? Um, Religious beliefs, cultural beliefs, family structure, situations, all of these things play into there being a negative or negatively impact the bond between the mom and the daughter. So there's
Mm.
all of these things, right? It didn't get processed, that emotional pain, that emotional trauma, and it was passed down from one generation to another. And these things, the cultural beliefs, religious beliefs, family beliefs, social structures, social beliefs, family structures, all of these things play into then the bond between the mom and the daughter, because we have to look at the culture, right? What we know
Mm-hmm.
that machismo and marianismo live in the Latina culture, and so we have to look at that
Mm-hmm.
family dynamics. This goes back to the nuance. What were the family systems, the secrets that were in that family, right? The values of the family. Even though we're, Latine, we're all different. We all,
Mm-hmm.
every state in Mexico and where we come from, Central America, like all of these things play into this. And so
Mm-hmm.
all of those things combined then impact and create this mother wound.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely from what I'm hearing is multi-layered, right? That I'm hearing that oftentimes comes from this intergenerational trauma, right? Or say the mother had experienced some kind of trauma, either some kind of adversity, right? Either physical,
Yeah,
emotional, neglect, abuse, right? Sexual abuse, or just like other things, right, that are
right.
considered also adversities, right? And somehow that led her to kind of create these coping mechanisms, right? Because I think I also want to really understand what is it that's happening, right, for the mother, for instance. And
Yeah,
when I do work with clients, uh, I think that there's a lot of grief involved, right? It's, as you mentioned, this grief of like, why did I have to have a mother this way? Why didn't I have a normal quote unquote mother who is loving, who is caring, who's accepting, who is not constantly criticizing me, who's not constantly making me feel like I'm not good enough or I'm never going to meet her standards or her expectations, right?
yeah,
Who is constantly, you know, giving me this feeling of rejection or abandonment, right, or betrayal, who's like putting me down, right? So I mean, I often think about with my clients is it's like what comes up a lot is the difficulty understanding their mother's experiences
yeah,
and not knowing exactly, as you mentioned, like not knowing exactly their story, not
yeah,
knowing exactly what happened to them, and maybe always kind of living with that. And going back to what I've been saying, it's not that we're justifying the abuse and these dynamics, but that I think as this healing process happens, and daughters or sons too, because honestly, like I've worked with a lot of men and they also experience a lot of narcissistic
oh
abuse
yeah,
from mothers
yeah,
and
of course.
fathers, okay? And that's a conversation for another episode. But it's, yeah, I guess, how do you work with clients, and how with this process of acceptance, right? Radical acceptance, and then processing this grief.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad that you brought up the grief, because the grief could be like lifelong, right? It just might
Mm.
not. It could look different, and so
Yeah.
uh, going back to that thing of just really understanding, like in what you said, the psychology of like what causes someone to be narcissistic, right? And so storytelling is a big part of our culture, and really asking the questions. A lot of the times when I talk to my clients of like, do you know anything about your mom or dad's, upbringing? And a lot of them don't know.
Mm.
They, because of maybe even like it might be difficult for parents to talk about it, or there might be some, it's almost like self-protected to not really go into like what happened to their childhood because it could be so painful, and it's like they're kind of reliving their trauma. And so for me, part of the healing was that really understanding what happened to my mom. What is
Mm,
this? What family dynamic did she come from? And
mm,
also seeing her from that human perspective of all the trauma that she experienced. And it
mhm,
became a survival mechanism, right? Because you
mhm,
talked about something about like, why does my mom abandon me? Or, why do I feel like abandoned by my mom or betrayed or rejected?
mhm,
And really, what people have to understand is that the narcissistic person does that to themselves, like without
mm,
realizing, as a form of survival. Because whatever it
mhm.
was that they were experiencing, it was too painful that
Yeah.
they had to create this different ego, right? For them to
Mm,
not really deal with the pain that they were going through. And
mm,
so really understanding that can help us. And again, this is part of the healing, and not that you have to get to this place, but to just see that before we came into this world, right? They also were living and experiencing, and like you said, having their own adversities. And not that it makes it right? That of course we're not
mhm,
deserving of this, but to just
mhm.
have that understanding is a big
Yes.
part of it.
And that can lead to a lot of grief, right, as well. Like just being able to process more of what that means for them, right?
Yeah,
What it means for survivors of narcissistic abuse. And
yeah,
I guess I'm just trying to differentiate with, I know you talked a little bit about like what happens to the adult children, right, when they do experience narcissistic abuse from a mother. What about like mother wounds? How is this all connected? I know you mentioned a little bit of like some of the things that come up, but how do you connect this into your like with when you're working with clients or just in general? How do you conceptualize
yeah.
this?
Right. Like, would you say, like, how does it like impact you? Like, in what areas of your
Yeah.
life?
In what
Yeah,
areas? Yeah.
yeah, in all aspects of your area of your life. If you think about it, your relationship
Mm,
with yourself first and foremost, your relationship with
mhm,
other people, with women, with men, with in romantic relationships, with money, career,
mm,
friendships, like all aspects of your life. Because
mhm,
we know as therapists that one of the most important relationships that we have is the one that we have with ourselves. And that all of that is going to mirror the friends that we choose, the partners that we're
mhm,
with. How are we with our profession? What professions we choose? How do you raise
mm,
your kids? Right? Do you want to have kids? Do you not? What kind of mom are you going to be?
mm,
And so
mhm,
it impacts everything, because really we just come back to, it's the relationship you have with yourself. And because of this mother wound, how did that negatively impact you? And some people don't have, like, they may not struggle in, perhaps they don't struggle in their friendships, right? Like they have solid core of like friends, but
mhm.
maybe they really struggle in their profession. Like they're scared
Yeah.
of putting themselves out there, or like they don't believe in themselves, and they're not pursuing their dreams because they're too
Mhm.
scared. And so it doesn't mean it's going to impact all of them, but it
Yeah.
can have an impact on all of these areas.
Yes, I think you bring up great points, and I can also really think about the impact that, as you mentioned, it impacts on ourselves, right? I'm sure what I've seen is like there's a lot of this sense of unworthiness, this fear of abandonment or rejection
Yeah.
in your relationships, either romantic or friendships. Like as you mentioned, difficulty setting boundaries, sometimes also like the expectations that you have for yourself and the
Hmm.
expectations that you have in your romantic relationships as well. And like just like the inner critic, right? The inner critic dialogue. And I think that's something that I do see a lot where they have this ongoing negative self talk about themselves in every situation, right? Feeling not worthy, not feeling good enough. And is this constant scarcity, this constant feel of lacking something. And it's something that I do see definitely a lot, and I've seen it in how it also manifests with clients, with others
Yeah.
in their romantic relationships, right?
Yeah.
And I guess, can you tell me a little bit of how that manifests?
Yeah, well, just to go back to what you were saying, it's almost like you internalize the voice of that
Yeah.
narcissistic mother where nothing was good enough, right? They were always raising the bar, and even you could be like the most successful person and have achieved a lot of things, but there's this emptiness that a narcissist feels, right? And so nothing fulfills them. They always want more. There's always something else that they're seeking. And so they project all of that onto their kids. And so even though you could have, be the president of the United States, and it
Mhm.
may not still be good enough. And so that's part of the healing of being able to separate from that and really start to look at, well, what is it that you really want? What makes you happy, right? Even if this would disappoint your mother, right? This
Mhm.
doesn't mean anything negative about you. And in
Mm.
romantic relationships, because you weren't modeled like what a healthy, secure, safe, connected relationship looks like, then you might be scared of that if you find somebody that provides that to you, and it might feel so
Mm.
off and you might self-sabotage if you
Yeah.
haven't done a lot of the healing, right? Or
Mhm.
you might just end up with someone that is also has those traits, or maybe is abusive and puts you
Mhm.
down and critical and is not safe and all of those things. And same thing goes with friendships or even in your
Mhm.
careers. You might stay in jobs that you're not satisfied. You might have a boss that's very demanding of you, and you're just like, well, this is all you know. And so on some level,
Mhm.
you think that this is normal, and you might stay there because, you know, you think this is it.
Right, right. So like the level of like normalizing this cycle of abuse almost like
Hmm.
repeats itself, right? The
Yeah,
patterns, the triggers, right? As you mentioned, like you might just think and feel like this is normal, and you don't question it, right? You just
right.
kind of go with it. So whoever is listening, how can they start, and they have experienced this, how can they start healing and breaking these patterns and cycles, right, of abuse?
Yeah, so I would definitely say find a therapist that's really well versed in narcissistic abuse, and that's going to help guide you through this process. And also, there's a lot of really good information, like really well written books on like all the different aspects of narcissism. And part of it too is like learning how to regulate your nervous system, really start to connect with yourself more, and honoring what it is that you think and feel, and learning how to trust yourself. And so, this is why having a therapist or a coach can really help you. Um,
Mhm.
Not to say that you can't do it on your own, but there's so much that comes when you're healing through this and you're doing the work that you
Mhm.
definitely need like a container. You need somebody that's going to be able to hold space and
Mhm.
guide you through the process as all the unlayering and unlearning happens through the healing process.
Yeah, thank you for naming all of these. A lot of the work that I do and that has been really helpful with clients that have experienced narcissistic mothers and abuse and mother wounds is reconnecting to their inner child, right? What is
Yeah,
it? And doing a lot of that inner child healing work. And I know when we start doing that work, it feels very foreign. It feels very scary. And it just brings up a lot of things, a lot of uh, triggers, right? But I realize that that is connecting back to your inner niña, your inner niño, your inner child really helps you to reclaim these different parts of yourself, and to give your inner child what is it that you actually needed and wanted,
right.
right? Because a lot of the times there's a lot of unmet needs that we have.
Yeah,
And this is where the struggle comes as we're navigating adult relationship, romantic or friendships, or navigating our careers or the workforce, is that we're so disconnected. You know, it feels like you're so disconnected that you don't even know what you want. You don't know
Right.
what you need. You don't know how to communicate that. So the language, the communication skills are not there. So a lot of this work is also exploring a lot of the things that brought you joy as a
Oh,
child,
yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And reconnecting with that. And I think there's many ways to do inner child healing work, but I'd say that that's a big start, is to reflect and think, well, how can I reconnect to my inner child? What are the things that brought me joy, happiness, playfulness, and start doing those things, right? I understand that therapy is a great approach. There are other ways of healing that are not also therapy. There's ancestral healing practices, there's dance, there's movement, there's somatic work, there's art, there's so many ways
Breath
to
work,
reconnect.
Reiki,
Breath
all of
work,
that stuff. Yeah, all
all of
I
that.
agree with you on all of that because I want to say that therapy was a big part of my healing, but a lot of it
Yeah.
really came through my spiritual practices. And
Yes.
spirituality to me is what has helped me become more grounded, secure, safe within myself. And so it's a mixture of everything, right? There
Yeah.
isn't just one thing. But I really like
Exactly.
what you said about like we're essentially reparenting ourselves and
Mhm.
really connecting to that fun, that joy, that inspiration that is really who we are, right?
Mhm.
But because of all of the trauma and conditioning, we forget that. And so
Mhm.
really coming back to that and like owning it, right? Being in
Mhm.
that like authenticity of like this is it and it's beautiful.
I
So
love that. I love that. If there was a last thing or something that you would want to tell maybe someone that is kind of going through a very rough, hard time, kind of navigating these challenging relationship dynamics, narcissistic, abusive mothers, but just like them noticing that they have a lot of to heal and a lot of inner work to do. What is a message that you would want to tell them? Like, say, a message of hope or
yeah.
encouragement?
Thank you for asking this. I think to just be gentle and take it one day at a time and to not put all this pressure, right? This is again not a like a one and done. It's a
Mhm.
journey
Yeah.
and just being so compassionate with yourself, which is part of this inner child healing, right? Just to be kind to yourself, like as you move through this, and that if you find yourself getting triggered over things that you thought you had already worked through, that's normal. That happens. That's like you
Mhm.
being human, right? That's we go
Mhm.
through this stuff. And so to not see it as like I'm done. Like I made it.
Mhm.
It's like, this is gonna be a process and sometimes
Yeah.
it's gonna be challenging and other times it's gonna be okay, it's gonna be good.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing
you're
that. And thank you
welcome.
so much for being here and sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, and your story. And
Of
I really
course.
hope that a lot of us, a lot of our listeners are resonating with this. So, where can folks find you? How can they work with you?
Yeah, so you can find me on my Instagram, Amor Therapy 2.0. I'm on TikTok on Amor Therapy, and you can also find me on Amor and Me. So at Amor and Me underscore on Instagram, and this is my coaching practice. So yes, that's
Okay.
where I'm at.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so
Yeah,
much. And whoever is listening, I hope that you are enjoying this episode and other episodes that I have out and this podcast. If you're loving it, share the love with your loved ones, follow, subscribe on YouTube and on Spotify, and then share and tag me and tag us because we would like to be part of that as well.
yeah.
So we will see you on the next episode. Thank you so much for listening. Nos vemos. Juriana, muchas gracias. Adiós.